My name is Elena. I used to think coming home meant finding peace, until my own voice became the weapon they used against me. The first dinner back felt like walking into a museum of my old life. Same table, same faces, same rituals. But when I opened my mouth to speak, something had shifted. 7 years in London had wrapped itself around my vowels, softened my consonants in ways I hadn't even noticed until I heard myself through their ears. Well, my sister Rebecca said, her fork pausing mid-air as her lips curved into that familiar smirk. Listen to Miss Fancy Pants over here. Pass the waiter, please. What happened to our good old country girl? The table erupted in laughter. Even Mom's shoulders shook as she tried to hide her grin behind her napkin. Dad just chuckled and shook his head like I was some amusing novelty. But Rebecca wasn't done. She never was. Seriously, Elena, did they make you practice that accent in a mirror? Because it sounds like you're trying really hard to be someone else. The words hit me like cold water. I set down my fork carefully, feeling heat crawl up my neck. This wasn't teasing. This was something sharper, something meant to cut. Before we continue, drop a comment. Where are you watching this from and what time is it there? I'd love to know how far this story is reaching. Because right now, sitting in that dining room, I felt more isolated than I ever had in any foreign city. The mockery became a ritual. Every family gathering, every casual conversation. Rebecca would zero in on my voice like a heat-seeking missile. She'd exaggerate my pronunciation until it sounded ridiculous, performing my accent like it was some elaborate joke we were all in on. Except I wasn't laughing. "Oh, Rebecca, stop," Mom would say half-heartedly, but her eyes still crinkled with amusement. Elena can't help how she sounds now. Can't help it. Like I had caught some disease. Like the years I'd spent learning to navigate boardrooms and lecture halls and coffee shops where no one knew my name had somehow infected me with pretension. What they didn't see were the nights I'd spent crying into my pillow in a tiny flat in Camden, homesick and desperate to belong somewhere. They didn't see me practicing presentations until my throat was raw, or the way I'd write down new phrases in a notebook, trying to decode not just the words, but the music behind them. They didn't see me learning to be brave in a language that wasn't quite mine, in rooms full of strangers who judged every syllable. But at that dinner table, none of that mattered. I was just their evening entertainment. "Elena's going through her Madonna phase," Rebecca announced to her friends when they came over. "You know, American accent and all. Very authentic." The sarcasm dripped from her voice like honey turned bitter. I started talking less. Why give them ammunition? I'd nod instead of speaking, smile instead of responding, retreat to my room where the silence couldn't be weaponized against me. They probably thought I was being aloof, but really, I was protecting myself the only way I knew how. The irony was crushing. For 7 years, I'd been hungry for the sound of home. I'd call Mom just to hear her voice, play old voicemails on repeat like lullabies. I dreamed of sitting around that very table, sharing stories and feeling held by the familiar rhythms of family conversation. Instead, I found myself starving in the middle of plenty, isolated by the very people who were supposed to know me best. Rebecca was planning her wedding during this time, and it became another stage for her performances. She'd practice her vows, in front of the family, then turn to me with theatrical concern. "Elena, honey, could you not do that British thing during my ceremony? It's going to sound so weird on the video." I wanted to ask her what British thing she meant. Was it the way I said rather instead of pretty? The way can't came out softer than before? Or was it just the fact that I sounded different, and different meant wrong in her carefully curated world? The worst part was watching our parents enable it. Dad would chuckle and shake his head like boys will be boys, except Rebecca was 28 and should have known better. Mom would give me these apologetic looks that said, "Sorry, but what can you do? She's just being Rebecca." But Rebecca wasn't. just being Rebecca. She was being cruel in that particular way that family members can be cruel, intimate and surgical, knowing exactly where the soft spots are and pressing until something gives. I started spending more time in the garden, my hands deep in soil that didn't judge the way I pronounced tomato. The plants didn't care that my accent had changed. They just grew when I tended them, bloomed when I gave them attention. It was honest work, uncomplicated by performance or expectation. That's where I was when the call came in. My laptop was balanced on the garden table, and I was reviewing a translation project, technical documentation for a renewable energy company. The work was intricate, requiring not just linguistic precision, but cultural sensitivity. Every word mattered. Every nuance could shift meaning in ways that rippled out into real-world consequences. I'd been doing this kind of work for 3 years, now building a reputation in specialized circles that valued accuracy over charm. My clients didn't care how I sounded on video calls. They cared that I could take complex ideas and make them accessible across languages and cultures. They cared that I delivered on time, every time, with the kind of attention to detail that came from understanding what it meant to be misunderstood. Dr. Marlon Hayes had been my most consistent collaborator, a linguistics professor at Cambridge with a gift for seeing patterns where others saw chaos. We'd worked on everything from academic papers to international policy documents, and he'd become something like a mentor, though I'd never said that out loud. Elena, his voice came through the laptop speakers, clear and warm despite the distance. I have a proposition for you. There's a UNESCO project coming up, a comprehensive translation of cultural preservation protocols. They need someone who understands both the technical requirements and the cultural implications. I felt my pulse quicken. UNESCO work was prestigious, the kind of assignment that could shift a career from steady to significant. But more than that, it was meaningful work, the kind that could make a real difference in how communities preserved and shared their heritage. The timeline is tight, Marlon continued. 6 weeks for the initial translation, plus ongoing consultation as they roll it out globally. It's a substantial contract, Elena, the kind that could set you up for the next phase of your career. Looked up from the laptop to see Rebecca walking across the yard, her wedding dress draped over her arm like a conquering flag. She was gesturing animatedly to Mom about something, probably another detail that needed to be perfect for her perfect day. I'm interested, I told Marlon, my voice steady in a way it hadn't been in weeks. Send me the details. Rebecca glanced over at me sitting with my laptop, and I saw her eyes narrow slightly. She couldn't hear what I was saying, but something about my posture, my focus, seemed to irritate her. Elena, could you maybe do your work thing somewhere else? We're trying to plan out here, she called. I looked at her for a long moment. Then, back at my screen where Marlon was sending through files that could change everything. Actually, I said, loud enough for her to hear, I'm exactly where I need to be. The work consumed me in the best possible way. For the next 3 weeks, I lived inside languages and cultures, translating not just words but entire worldviews. The UNESCO project required me to understand how different communities conceptualized heritage, how they passed down knowledge, how they wanted to share their stories with the world. It was exhausting and exhilarating, the kind of challenge that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with this work in the first place. Every day brought new puzzles to solve, new connections to make between languages that had evolved on different continents, but somehow shared deep structural similarities. Marlon and I worked in synchrony, passing drafts back and forth, refining nuances, double-checking cultural references. He had an uncanny ability to spot where my translations might inadvertently carry assumptions from my own cultural background, and I had developed an eye for where his academic language needed to be made more accessible. You're doing something remarkable here, he told me during one of our late-night video calls. This isn't just translation, it's cultural architecture. You're building bridges. I felt something in my chest expand at his words. This was who I was, who I'd become during those years away. Not the joke version of myself that Rebecca performed at dinner, but someone who could take the complexity of human expression and make it accessible across divides. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, being praised for the very thing my family mocked, my ability to navigate between languages, to carry meanings across cultural boundaries. The accent that made me a source of entertainment at home was actually evidence of something they couldn't see. Adaptability, resilience, the willingness to be changed by experience. Rebecca's wedding was 2 weeks away, and the house had become a staging ground for her vision of perfection. Flowers arrived daily, vendors came and went, and every conversation revolved around seating charts and centerpieces, and whether the lighting would be romantic enough for photos. I stayed in my orbit, working in the garden or my room, surfacing, only for meals where the conversation was thankfully focused on wedding logistics, rather than my pronunciation. But I could feel Rebecca watching me sometimes, like she was waiting for something, some moment to pounce. It came during a family dinner when she was talking about her wedding venue, a restored manor house an hour outside the city. She was describing the international cuisine they'd be serving, the wine pairings, the way the whole event would have this cosmopolitan elegance. "We're even having some vendors who don't speak English," she said, clearly pleased with this detail. "So sophisticated, right? Though I have no idea how we're going to communicate with them." She paused, and I felt the shift in the room's energy. Everyone was looking at me, waiting. "I mean," Rebecca continued, her voice taking on that familiar edge. "I guess we could ask Elena to help, if she can remember how to talk like a normal person." The words hung in the air like smoke. I felt my parents' eyes on me, waiting to see how I'd react, whether I'd shrink back into silence or try to defend myself in ways they could dismiss. Instead, I surprised myself by smiling. "What languages do they speak?" I asked, my voice calm and clear. Rebecca blinked, thrown off by my response. I think Italian, and maybe some French? I don't really know. The wedding planner is handling all that." I nodded thoughtfully. "Well, if you need help communicating with them, I'd be happy to assist. I've done quite a bit of work with hospitality and event management translations." Something flickered across Rebecca's face. Confusion, maybe, or irritation that I hadn't taken the bait. But before she could respond, my phone buzzed with a message from Marlon. "Excuse me," I said, checking the notification. "This is time-sensitive." The message was brief but electrifying. UNESCO approved the translation. Full contract signed. They want to discuss the next phase. "Can you talk tomorrow?" I felt my world tilt slightly, everything reorganizing around this moment. The UNESCO project hadn't just been approved, it had been so well received that they wanted to expand it. This was the kind of professional breakthrough that could reshape everything. I looked up to find Rebecca staring at me with narrowed eyes. "What's so important that it can't wait through dinner?" she asked. I met her gaze steadily. "Work," I said simply. She snorted. "Right. Your little translation. Hobby." The word hobby hit like a slap, but instead of stinging, it crystallized something inside me. I thought about the months of careful work that had led to this moment, the recognition from one of the world's most respected cultural organizations, the impact this project could have on communities trying to preserve their heritage. "Actually," I said, my voice carrying a new kind of authority, "it's my career, and it's going quite well." Rebecca's smirk faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Well, don't let us interrupt your very important phone calls." I smiled again, but this time it reached my eyes. "I won't." The next morning, I was in the garden early, laptop open, waiting for Marlon's call. The air was crisp with the promise of spring, and I felt more awake than I had in weeks. The UNESCO approval had shifted something fundamental, not just professionally, but in how I saw myself, how I understood my place in the world. When Marlon's face appeared on the screen, he was beaming. "Elena, congratulations. The feedback from UNESCO has been extraordinary. They're calling your work culturally sensitive, academically rigorous, and beautifully accessible. That's a rare combination. I felt warmth spread through my chest. What's the next phase? They want you to lead a team for the global rollout. It would mean working with translators from 15 different countries, coordinating cultural adaptation strategies, possibly some travel for training workshops. It's a significant undertaking. Leading a team, international coordination, the kind of responsibility that would establish me not just as a translator, but as a thought leader in cultural preservation. I felt dizzy with the possibility of it. There's one more thing, Marlon continued. They're hosting a ceremony next month to officially launch the project. They want the key contributors there, including you. It's quite an honor, Elena. The kind of recognition that opens doors. A ceremony. Official recognition. I thought about Rebecca's wedding, about being relegated to the sidelines while she starred in her own production. This felt different, earned, authentic, mine. I'll be there, I said. After the call ended, I sat in the garden for a long time, watching the light shift through the leaves. 7 years ago, I'd left home feeling small and uncertain, carrying nothing but hope and determination. I'd returned feeling like I'd lost something essential, like the place that had shaped me no longer recognized who I'd become. But maybe that wasn't loss. Maybe that was growth. The week before Rebecca's wedding, the house became a circus of final preparations. Florists arrived at dawn, caterers did walkthroughs, and Rebecca orchestrated it all with the intensity of a military commander. She was in her element, directing traffic and making pronouncements about everything from napkin placement to the exact angle of the altar arrangements. I stayed out of the way, working on the UNESCO project expansion, while the chaos swirled around me. The preliminary team assignments had come through, and I was reviewing profiles of translators from around the world, specialists in everything from Mandarin to Swahili, each bringing their own expertise to the Cultural Preservation Initiative. It was fascinating work, the kind that made me lose track of time. I was deep in correspondence with a translator from São Paulo about Portuguese colonial influences on contemporary Brazilian cultural documentation when Rebecca burst into my room without knocking. Elena, I need to talk to you, she said, her voice tight with stress. I looked up from my laptop, noting the way her hands were clenched at her sides. What's wrong? The wedding planner just called. Apparently the Italian vendors are having some kind of issue with the contract. Something about liability insurance and translation discrepancies. They're threatening to pull out 3 days before my wedding. I felt a familiar twist in my stomach. The same feeling I'd gotten as a child when Rebecca was upset about something, and I was somehow expected to fix it. What do you need from me? Her expression shifted, vulnerability flickering across her face before being replaced by something harder. I need you to call them. Talk to them in Italian or whatever. Fix this. The request hung between us like a challenge. Here was Rebecca, who had spent weeks mocking my accent, my voice, my way of speaking, now needing exactly what she'd been ridiculing. The irony was so sharp it almost made me laugh. I thought you said I should stop doing the British thing, I said quietly. Rebecca's face flushed. This is different. This is important. Important, I repeated, tasting the word. Unlike my work, which is just a hobby. She had the grace to look uncomfortable. Look, I know I've been difficult, but this is my wedding, Elena. I need your help. I studied her face, seeing something I hadn't seen in years, genuine fear. Not just about the wedding, but about being exposed, about her perfect vision crumbling. For a moment, I felt the old instinct to rush in and fix things, to smooth over the rough edges and make everything okay. But then I thought about the UNESCO ceremony, about the team I'd be leading, about the recognition that was mine because I'd earned it. I thought about the years of building something meaningful while she'd been tearing me down. I'll make some calls, I said finally. But Rebecca, we need to talk after the wedding. Really talk. Relief flooded her features. Thank you. I knew you'd come through. The Italian vendors were actually quite reasonable once I explained the situation properly. The contract confusion had been a matter of legal terminology that didn't translate cleanly between languages, creating ambiguity around liability coverage. Within an hour, I'd facilitated a three-way call between Rebecca's wedding planner, the insurance company, and the vendors, clarifying terms and ensuring everyone understood their obligations. Sei stata molto utile, one of the vendors told me as we wrapped up the call. Grazie mille. You've been very helpful. Thank you so much. Simple words, but they carried weight in a way that Rebecca's grudging gratitude hadn't. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, with the kind of golden light that photographers dream about. Rebecca looked stunning in her dress. All sharp angles and soft curves, her happiness radiating outward like sunlight. For a moment, watching her get ready, I remembered why I'd loved her so fiercely as a child. Her confidence, her ability to command attention, her refusal to be anything less than exactly who she was. But then she caught sight of me in the mirror and frowned. Elena, you're not wearing that, are you? I looked down at my outfit, a navy dress that was elegant but understated, appropriate for the occasion without upstaging the bride. What's wrong with it? It's so plain. And could you maybe try to sound more normal today? For the photos and everything? There it was again, the casual cruelty disguised as concern. I felt something inside me crystallize, a decision I hadn't even realized I was making. I'll sound exactly like myself, I said, because that's who I am. The ceremony was beautiful. Rebecca glowed as she walked down the aisle, and her new husband looked at her like she was the answer to every question he'd ever had. I felt genuine happiness for her in that moment, despite everything. Love was love, and it deserved to be celebrated. The reception was held in the restored manor house she'd chosen, with its soaring ceilings and elegant stonework. The international vendors had outdone themselves. Italian cuisine that was both sophisticated and comforting. French wines that paired perfectly with each course. Service that was seamless and professional. I found myself at a table with distant relatives and family friends, making polite conversation and deflecting questions about my interesting accent, with practiced ease. The familiar weight of performance settled over me. The exhausting work of managing other people's perceptions. It was during the cocktail hour, when Rebecca was holding court with her new in-laws, that I saw a familiar figure approaching across the room. Tall, distinguished, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to academic settings. Marlon Hayes looked exactly as I'd imagined him from our video calls. Silver hair, kind eyes, the sort of presence that suggested both intelligence and warmth. He was wearing an impeccably tailored suit and carrying a leather portfolio that immediately caught my attention. Elena, he said, extending his hand with a warm smile. Finally, we meet in person. I felt the conversation around me pause as people turned to look at this stranger who had somehow found me in the crowd. Rebecca, from across the room, was staring with obvious curiosity. Marlon, I said, standing to greet him. I didn't expect to see you here. I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I was in the area for a conference at the university, and I thought this might be the perfect opportunity to deliver some news in person. He opened his portfolio and withdrew a thick document with official UNESCO letterhead. The contract for the Global Cultural Preservation Initiative. They wanted you to have the signed copy before the ceremony next month. I stared at the papers, my heart hammering. The contract? Congratulations, Elena. You're officially the lead coordinator for one of the most ambitious cultural preservation projects in UNESCO's history. The compensation reflects the scope of the work. It's quite substantial. He named a figure that made my vision blur slightly. Not just substantial, life-changing. The kind of salary that would establish me as a leader in my field, that would give me the freedom to choose projects based on passion rather than necessity. I don't understand. Rebecca's voice cut through my shock. She had approached our table, her face a mask of polite confusion. I'm sorry, but who are you? Marlon turned to her with the same warm smile he'd given me. Dr. Marlon Hayes, Cambridge University. I'm Elena's colleague and, I suppose, her advocate at UNESCO. UNESCO? Rebecca's voice had gone up an octave. The United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, Marlon explained patiently. Elena has just been appointed as the lead coordinator for our Global Cultural Preservation Initiative. It's quite an honor. She was selected from a pool of over 200 candidates worldwide. I watched Rebecca's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been panic. Around us, the conversations had stopped entirely. Even our parents had drifted over, drawn by the gravity of the moment. I'm sorry, Rebecca said, her voice strained. There must be some mistake. Elena does translation work, from home. It's not... she doesn't what? Marlon asked, his tone still pleasant, but with an edge of steel. Rebecca floundered, suddenly aware that she was standing in front of a Cambridge professor, diminishing someone he clearly respected. I just meant, it's not like she has a real career or anything. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel the weight of every eye in the vicinity, the collective intake of breath as people processed what they'd just witnessed. Marlon's expression remained calm, but something shifted in his posture. I'm afraid I disagree. Elena's work has been instrumental in preserving cultural heritage for communities around the world. Her translation of the Maasai Oral History Project alone has been cited in over 50 academic papers. The UNESCO appointment recognizes her as one of the foremost experts in cross-cultural communication. He turned back to me, his voice warming again. In fact, that's why I wanted to deliver this news personally. The selection committee was unanimous. They specifically noted your ability to bridge cultural divides while maintaining the integrity of the original message. It's a rare gift. I felt something inside me expand, like a flower finally getting sunlight after a long winter. This was recognition not just of my work, but of who I'd become. Someone who could take the complexity of human expression and make it accessible across languages and cultures. Thank you, I said, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm me. This means more than you know. There's one more thing, Marlon said, withdrawing another document from his portfolio. The project requires extensive international collaboration. We'd like to offer you a position as a permanent consultant to UNESCO's Cultural Preservation Division. It would mean working with communities from around the world, helping them document and share their heritage stories. I stared at the second contract, my mind racing. A permanent position with UNESCO. International travel. The chance to work with communities whose stories had never been heard beyond their borders. It was everything I'd dreamed of, and more than I'd dared to hope for. I need some time to consider this, I said. Of course. But Elena, I hope you understand what this represents. You're being offered a chance to shape how the world understands and preserves cultural heritage. Your voice, exactly as it is, would be carrying stories that need to be heard. My voice, exactly as it is. I glanced at Rebecca, who was still standing frozen beside us, her face pale. Around us, the wedding guests were murmuring among themselves, processing what they'd just witnessed. Could I introduce you to my family? I asked Marlon. He nodded graciously, and I turned to face my parents, who were standing nearby with expressions of stunned bewilderment. Mom, Dad, this is Dr. Marlon Hayes from Cambridge University. He's been my colleague on several international projects. My parents stepped forward, suddenly formal in the way people become when they realize they're in the presence of someone important. Dr. Hayes, my father said, extending his hand. It's a pleasure to meet you. The pleasure is mine, Marlon replied. You should be very proud of Elena. Her work has had a profound impact on cultural preservation efforts worldwide. I watched my parents exchange glances, saw the moment when years of assumptions began to crumble. They'd thought I was just playing around with languages, making a little money from home. They'd had no idea that I was building something significant, something that mattered. We had no idea, my mother said quietly. Elena never mentioned. She's quite modest about her achievements, Marlon said, but I can tell you that her reputation in academic circles is exceptional. Universities across Europe have been trying to recruit her for years. Universities. Trying to recruit me. I felt a laugh bubbling up in my chest. Not cruel, but incredulous. While Rebecca had been mocking my accent, institutions of higher learning had been recognizing my expertise. I should let you get back to the celebration, Marlon said, closing his portfolio. But Elena, please do consider the UNESCO position. The world needs voices like yours. After he left, the silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Rebecca's wedding reception continued around us, but our little corner of the world had become an island of stunned quiet. Elena, my father said finally, his voice careful. Why didn't you tell us? I looked at him, then at my mother, then at Rebecca, who was still standing there with her mouth slightly open. When? I asked. When exactly? Should I have mentioned it? Between the jokes about my accent? During the performances of how I sound? Rebecca flinched as if I'd struck her. I didn't know, she whispered. You didn't want to know, I said, my voice gentle but firm. You wanted me to be the same person who left 7 years ago. You wanted me to be small enough to fit back into the box you'd built for me. That's not fair, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? I asked. Rebecca, you've spent months mocking the way I speak. You've called my work a hobby. You've made me feel like a stranger in my own family because I had the audacity to be changed by my experiences. Tears were forming in her eyes now, and I felt my anger soften into something more complex. This was still my sister, still the person who had once been my closest ally. But we had both changed, grown in different directions, and neither of us had known how to bridge the gap. I was jealous, she said suddenly, the words tumbling out. You left. You went out into the world and became someone important while I stayed here, doing the same things, being the same person. And then you came back sounding different, and it reminded me that I hadn't grown at all. The admission hung between us, raw and honest. I felt my heart crack open, not with pain but with understanding. Rebecca's cruelty hadn't been about my accent. It had been about her own fear of stagnation, her own sense of being left behind. You did grow, I said softly. You built a life here. You found love. You created something beautiful. I gestured around us at the wedding reception, at the celebration she'd orchestrated with such care. This is your achievement, Rebecca. It's yours. She wiped her eyes carefully, trying not to smudge her makeup. I'm sorry, she said. I'm so sorry, Elena. I didn't understand what I was doing to you. I reached out and took her hand. I know, and I'm sorry too. I should have tried harder to explain, to help you understand who I was becoming. We stood there for a moment, sisters again, connected by something deeper than the hurt we'd inflicted on each other. Around us, the reception continued, but the music seemed softer now, the conversation more distant. So, Rebecca said, attempting a smile. UNESCO, huh? That's kind of a big deal. It's a very big deal, I said, smiling back. The biggest deal of my career, actually. Are you going to take the permanent position? I looked around the room, at the life Rebecca had built here, at our parents who were still processing what they'd learned about their daughter. Then, I thought about the communities around the world whose stories were waiting to be told. About the bridges I could build between cultures, about the impact I could have. I think I am, I said. Good, Rebecca said, squeezing my hand. You should. The world needs to hear your voice. Your voice. Not a performance of someone else's expectations, not a diluted version of who I used to be, but my voice, exactly as it was. Shaped by experience, tempered by struggle, enriched by the courage to be changed by the world. Later that evening, after the dancing had wound down and the guests had begun to drift away, I found myself alone in the garden outside the manor house. The air was cool and clean, filled with the scent of roses and the distant sound of laughter from the reception. I thought about the girl who had left home 7 years ago, uncertain and afraid, but determined to see what lay beyond the familiar boundaries of her world. I thought about the woman who had returned, carrying new ways of speaking and being, only to find that home had no space for who she'd become. And now I was someone else entirely, not the girl who had left, or the woman who had returned, but someone who had learned to value her own voice above the comfort of others' approval. Someone who understood that belonging didn't mean shrinking to fit old spaces, but expanding those spaces to accommodate growth. The UNESCO contract was still in my hands, the weight of it both thrilling and terrifying. This was my chance to step fully into who I'd become, to use my voice not just to translate words but to bridge worlds. The accent that had been a source of shame in my family's eyes was actually my passport to a larger purpose. I thought about Marlon's words. The world needs voices like yours, not voices like I used to have, not voices that sounded like everyone else's, but voices that carried the music of multiple places, the wisdom of boundary crossing, the courage of reinvention. My phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. Thank you for saving my wedding, and thank you for showing me what it looks like to be brave. I smiled, typing back. Thank you for reminding me that coming home isn't about becoming who you used to be. It's about bringing who you've become back to the people you love. As I walked back toward the reception, I could hear the sound of my own footsteps echoing off the stone walls of the manor house. Each step sounded clear and confident, marking a rhythm that was entirely my own. And for the first time since I'd returned home, I realized that I wasn't trying to find my voice anymore. I was finally ready to use it. Some people spend their whole lives trying to sound like everyone else. I'd learned something different. That the most beautiful voices are the ones that carry the traces of every place they've been, every person they've met, every moment that changed them. My accent wasn't a betrayal of where I came from. It was evidence of how far I'd traveled, how much I'd grown, how willing I'd been to let the world reshape me. And now, with UNESCO's recognition in my hands and my sister's apology in my heart, I was ready to take that voice out into the world and use it to help others find theirs. Because that's what translation really is. Not just converting words from one language to another, but helping people understand that their stories matter, that their voices deserve to be heard, that the music of their particular way of speaking carries something essential that the world needs. They had mocked my accent. But my accent had opened doors they couldn't even imagine, had connected me to opportunities they'd never dreamed of, had become the very thing that made me valuable to the world beyond their small circle of understanding. The joke, it turned out, had been on them all along.